Hi, I'm Robbie Bobby. This video is the first in a series that examines the laundry list, otherwise known as the 14 traits of an adult child. The topic of this video is Trait 1, which reads, "We became isolated and afraid of people and authority figures." The key words to properly understand this trait are isolated and authority figures. Your interpretation of these terms will have an effect on how you identify with the trait. If your understanding is limited, your identification will also be limited. When I first came into ACA, I associated becoming isolated with being a loner, someone who avoids being around other people. But since I spent a good amount of time around other people, including my girlfriend at the time, I didn't feel that it applied to me. But as I started to do trait work, I came to see that isolation can take many forms, including isolating my true self. A good example is Trait 2, which says, "We became approval seekers and lost our identity in the process." Therefore, when I'm people-pleasing, I isolate my true self. Or if I'm practicing the don't talk rule and don't express my true feelings, then I'm emotionally isolating myself. And since I do these things when I'm around other people, I realize I don't have to be alone in order to isolate. This increased my identification with the trait. Trait 1 also talks about fear of authority figures, which I identified with, but my interpretation was limited to people such as police or bosses. As I started to do trait work, I came to see that my ACA brain can make just about anyone an authority figure, and each trait can help identify them. In Trait 1, who is it that makes me want to isolate, either physically or emotionally? For me, it could be just about anyone, including people I'm closest with. In Trait 2, whose approval do I seek to the point of losing my identity? I find it helpful to go through each trait and ask myself, who triggers this trait? And then put that person or type of person on my list of potential authority figures, either real or imagined. My list now includes parents, friends, girlfriends, coworkers, anyone who knows more than me, which includes doctors, lawyers. The list goes on and on. When I was married, my wife was the ultimate authority figure. I can see now she was also an imaginary authority figure, as most of mine were. By the way, I can also stack imagined authority on top of actual authority, giving police or bosses, for example, way more authority than they actually have. Needless to say, looking into these terms has greatly expanded my understanding of the trait, and therefore my identification with it. This is how I describe Trait 1 in my own words. I have a general fear of people due to the fact that everyone is a potential authority figure, which is what I really fear because authority figures have imagined power over me that makes me want to isolate, either physically or emotionally. For the remainder of this video, I'd like to share some of the ways I've learned to look at the traits in general and apply them to Trait 1. The first is by asking, how does this trait show up in my life? What are the symptoms? In other words, what are the feelings and behaviors associated with the trait? For example, if I'm physically isolating, it can cause me to feel lonely or bored. Of course, I can feel this way for other reasons. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm acting on Trait 1, but it does raise a flag, which allows me the opportunity to look into it. If I'm in the company of others, I may go into people-pleasing mode or have an urge to get out of there if I'm feeling uncomfortable. In the moment, I may not associate these feelings or behaviors with the traits. After all, they're so ingrained and automatic that I simply react. This is the nature of survival traits. However, if I can recognize the symptoms before I react to them, I can ask myself a simple question. Who am I making an authority figure? I can also reassure my inner child or inner teen as one or the other is likely being triggered. Another way to look at the traits is from the perspective of step 1, which says we're powerless over the effects of living with alcoholism. And the effects, of course, are the traits. So the question becomes, am I powerless over trait 1? Since I have a good understanding of how this trait operates inside of me, I can see that I have 2 levels of powerlessness. The first is over the need to isolate, either physically or emotionally. I can't simply turn this off. I believe that I'm most powerless over this initial inner reaction. Maybe it shows up as a need to hightail it out of a meeting as soon as it ends because I suddenly feel uncomfortable without the structure of a meeting. An ex-girlfriend used to call me a ninja because I would disappear so quickly. The next level of powerlessness is over my outer reaction. In other words, do I stick around despite the uncomfortable feelings, or do I head for the exit? If I head for the exit, I'm doubly powerless. In step 1, we also admit that these traits make our lives unmanageable. Does trait 1 make your life unmanageable? If so, how? I think this depends on your definition or understanding of unmanageable. For me, it takes on a different meaning from other programs. In the context of ACA recovery, unmanageability can mean acting out on traits. For me, having imaginary authority figures which cause me to isolate, either physically or emotionally, is total unmanageability in terms of managing to be my true self. How many people create what looks like a perfect life from the outside, yet suffer because their true self has been forced into hiding? It pays to give some serious thought as to what unmanageability means to you. And finally, how do the Tony A steps, which are rooted in healing and self-love, help me to recover from this trait? I think it's the wounded and traumatized parts of myself, my inner child, that imagines people to be authority figures, which triggers the need to isolate. If I can heal these parts, which can only be done through consistent and ongoing self-love, then imagined authority, which I have assigned, along with all of the symptoms of trait 1, disappear. By the way, healing the inner child is the solution for all the traits, not just trait 1. And since all the traits support each other, self-love leads to the collapse of the entire dysfunctional structure. And that wraps up this video, which was meant to be food for thought. If you found it helpful, please click like and forward to a fellow traveler. If you want to catch the next installment, which is trait 2, click subscribe. I'm Robbie Bobby. Thank you for listening, and as always, keep coming back.